ce sera un forum assez informel, donc s'il vous plaît, n'hésitez pas à m'interrompre, à poser des questions, à apporter d'autres points, à me dire quand j'ai complètement tort, et ainsi de suite. Donc, c'est toujours apprécié. J'ai été en fait un peu optimiste dans la planification. Donc, j'avais donné un titre sensibilisation aux liens lexicaux et finalement, je pense que je suis allée bien au-delà de ça. Mais des choses que je trouvais intéressantes et utiles, et peut-être pour essayer de vous donner un peu plus de contexte. Je ne sais pas combien d'entre vous avez déjà une bonne idée de comment ça fonctionne, nos programmes de traduction, etc., à part Marianne, qui n'a pas le choix. Alors, je vais essayer de vous mettre un peu en contexte, de vous montrer certaines des difficultés que les traducteurs et surtout des futurs traducteurs vont rencontrer. Donc, c'est à peu près le plan pour aujourd'hui. Et je m'excuse, je suis un peu enfumée, donc je suis vraiment désolée pour le bruit. Donc, on commencera avec une petite discussion, une mise en scène sur la traduction spécialisée et les tâches du traducteur qui travaille en spécialisé, donc les compétences et connaissances requises, les défis qu'ils rencontrent, et puis comment on essaie de préparer donc des étudiants à ce genre de travail. Et aussi, je vais parler principalement de 3 stratégies que nous mettons en œuvre actuellement, soit dans le cadre de recherche, soit dans le cadre de notre enseignement, c'est-à-dire d'optimiser la consultation des ressources terminologiques et lexicographiques, de faire appel aux technologies comme complément à ces ressources existantes. Et puis, à la toute fin, je vais peut-être essayer de commencer une petite discussion de quelque chose que vous connaissez probablement beaucoup mieux que moi, c'est la contextualisation de la formation. Donc, quelques stratégies utilisées pour mieux entourer l'enseignement de certaines tâches ou certaines stratégies dans le cadre d'un programme. Donc, quand j'ai commencé, en fait, sachant à qui j'aurais affaire aujourd'hui, j'ai essayé de penser, en fait, à quelle similarité et différence il pourrait y avoir entre traducteur et apprenant la langue. Et chaque fois que je pensais avoir identifié quelque chose qui est vraiment particulier au traducteur, qui n'est pas partagé par des apprenants de la langue, non, finalement, non. On se partage pas mal tous les mêmes besoins, les mêmes priorités, les mêmes connaissances nécessaires. Et donc, évidemment, tout le monde va devoir maîtriser des questions de vocabulaire, de syntaxe, de culture, de typographie et bien sûr des capacités de recherche. Donc, je vais présenter ça un peu, peut-être comme une question de degré ou de contexte. Donc, c'est dans quel contexte qu'un traducteur va devoir maîtriser ces choses-là. Qu'est-ce qui est important ou le plus important pour le traducteur. Mais néanmoins, j'invite votre rétroaction, vos suggestions et surtout vos apports à cette discussion. Oui. Yes. And absolutely. And in fact, the rest of the presentation is largely in English. In fact, I'm sorry, I had planned to switch to English with this slide, and then I sort of forgot. But that is the plan, indeed. So no problem. No, it's my pleasure. In fact, I had meant to say that it would be mostly in English, but I threw in a few things in French. So I think we should be good for now. I've switched. Okay, so this is a quote that I like very much about the nature of specialized translation. It comes from a book in '93, but I think it's very much still relevant. So this is a book on training specialized translators, and the editors said that specialized translation requires not only a firm mastery of both the source and target languages, but at least an informed layman's understanding of the subject field, coupled with the research skills needed to write like an expert. And I love this. I think this is really interesting on many levels. I think it gives you a good introduction. But I also like the fact that it highlights the fact that the translator usually has a fair to good knowledge of a subject field, we hope, but has to write as if they have an excellent knowledge, a cutting edge, really in-depth knowledge of the field. And so when I read this, the first expression that came to mind for me was fake it till you make it. And I think translators really have to be able to do a certain amount of that. But what's interesting to me is that there's also a question of time here. The translator is typically doing this on a very tight timeline, sometimes changing from client to client, from field to field, within a day, a week, or certainly a month, particularly if you're a freelancer. So what happens then, I think, is it's not so much a question of faking it till you make it, but faking it until it's time to fake something different. So we're constantly honing those research skills that allow us to keep up and write like an expert, even though we have a fairly limited training probably in the specialized field we're working in. And that can mean managing a whole lot of things. So I think when we think about technical translation or specialized translation, it's fairly certain that everyone will think about learning new concepts, technical concepts, specialized concepts, and even dealing with maybe fine distinctions between them. So, you know, what's the difference between a cave and a cavern? Well, you might have to learn that to figure out those distinctions. And you need to attach terms to them. And terms come with difficulties like polyphony and synonymy and variation. So we might have mismatches between single concepts and single terms. But added to that, I think, are a lot of things that we don't necessarily think of in technical fields but are still extremely important. So not just terms, but what are they used with? How are they used? In which context? So variation with level of language, region, with culture. Certainly collocations are hugely important. And even surprisingly in some fields, things like dealing with plays on words, with poetics, with rhyme, with imagery, all of that can actually come into play even in technical text, depending on the field. And that is, I think, one of the most interesting things that a technical specialized translator needs to deal with. So I'll touch on some of these, and I definitely welcome your feedback or your suggestions on some others. And I decided to take the example of the field that I'm currently working with or in with some of my students, and that I've used for teaching translation before, technical translation, which is underwater diving and scuba diving. I don't know, are there any divers in the room? Okay, good, good. All right, well, you guys shut up because I don't want to hear from you. You can tell me afterwards all the mistakes I made. So what I just wanted to kind of point out is the complexity of this kind of field that you have to learn when you start diving. And it takes a lot of training to start diving to get certified. And a translator very often is not going to have this. But what they will have to do if they're working in this field is learn a certain amount about things like health and safety. So diving is an extreme sport, which means it has a certain amount of danger. So they need to learn about where that comes from. A lot of that comes from knowing the physics of diving underwater. So Boyle's law is the first thing you learn when you start diving. So you have to know about that. And so you go through extensive training and certification to make sure that you're safe. And this covers both the principles and the equipment that you need, a fair bit of it. You have to think about destinations, where you might dive, what kind of environment you might be working in. There's a lot of vocabulary and knowledge that comes along with that. And the protection of the environment is managed with things like, regulations that are in place. So you have legal language that goes along with them, which also covers health and safety, of course. So how to manage health and safety. And so essentially what we have are a variety, a huge range of different aspects of the field, all covered by a variety of different text types and a range of vocabulary. And so getting thrown into an environment like this for a new translator particularly can be very intimidating. So I went through some old dive magazines and looked for some of the problems that translators might have, just to kind of situate you a little bit in what you might, what a translation student might encounter, and if they are unlucky enough to get stuck in my class, have to do something about it. And I love this field because we have such a range of these text types. So I've given you a lot of ads in this presentation because they're just fun to work with. So there's a lot of advertising. We advertise equipment, we advertise resorts, we advertise destinations. And of course, there's a certain presentation that goes along with this. So we see here, for example, that we're talking about the speed demon of fins. We are using imagery of the devils in the details, wicked style, and so on. So there's a lot of attention to that presentation, there's a lot of imagery there, even though you're in a fairly technical environment here. We might have reviews of new deer, and just about every dive magazine, every issue has a new deer excuse me, section. But there are also articles intended to inform, to train. There might be coverage of laws and regulations, best practices for operators. And all of these are going to have their own particularities in vocabulary, in presentation, in style, and so on that a translator may need to adapt to. And some of these can be among the most central messages that we get for a particular brand. So little phrases that are used in promotional materials. These are some typical scuba manufacturers with their slogans. So Scuba Pro says, deep down you want the best. Or Mare's slogan is just add water. You can imagine how difficult it would be for a translator to render these appropriately. So we can render the surface message, maybe with a little bit of thought, but that punch, that brand is extremely difficult to get across. And in fact, I took all of these from a French language diving magazine, so they hadn't even attempted. It was just too difficult, so they left the English slogan. I'm not sure that would fly in Quebec, so this is Concourdancers out of the French. I don't really know if that would work in Quebec. So at some point, somebody is going to have to sit down and deal with these if these companies want to advertise in the Quebec market. Extremely challenging for translators. So, there'll be a test at the end. Anybody who can come up with a good slogan in French, either one of those two. So there's a real attention to form and impact, but as well there's all that classical type of terminology that you're familiar with. So we might, for example, need to know what a détendeur or a premier étage surcompensé avec membrane would be in English. Even after a lot of reading, I'm not entirely sure I'd know offhand what those would be. And I think a student coming in reading scuba material for the first time would have a very hard time coming up with it. But it means we have to learn quite a lot of vocabulary very quickly. So let's do just a quick little test here. So if I gave you the example, les palmes. Exactly. That's exactly right. If I gave you les palmes, think about how you might translate les palmes for a minute. And now, how many of you were able, not being divers, to spontaneously come up with flippers? You're wrong. And this is really interesting. This is the difference between what a layperson knows and what a diver would know. And it's totally natural. Every time I ask this question, that's exactly what people say. Those are flippers. For a scuba diver, they're not flippers. They can't, no one would ever say flippers in a scuba diving video. Scuba divers, scuba. There we go. Exactly. So these are their fins in the scuba. And yes, so flipper is a dolphin, and he usually minds if you try and wear him on your feet. So yes, so they would be fins. So that's the kind of thing that we have to sometimes break away with what we think we know and learn how things are actually used. And this is not limited to the terms, and a lot of you are very familiar with collocations. So we can use a simple example here. So this is an ad, sorry, black on black, not very helpful, for a wetsuit. And so in French, the ad says, sa conception unique permet de la mettre et de l'ôter sans problème. So how might you try and translate to English mettre and ôter? Everybody can do Okay, so that's an interesting way. So to get in and get out, which actually has a wonderful image with diving, right? Get in and get out. Okay, good. Any other ideas or any other suggestions? Feel is nice. I like that. It's like a banana. Seriously, every time someone's trying to get out of a wetsuit, it kind of looks like trying to peel a giant banana. Interestingly enough, there's a fairly well-established collocation for wetsuits, and it, at least in some publications, in the one that I'm going to show you, and it's really unusual when you hear that collocation broken. So, in the case of a wetsuit, typically we'll talk about donning and doffing. And they usually, usually in an ad, you might get something as simple as easy to don and doff. And that's all they say, which is very hard to predict. And collocations, by definition, are hard to predict. But this is among the harder, I would say, unless you're actually in the environment. And you can see that they're even building on these, so self-donning and so on. So really, one of the biggest challenges, of course, for translators to work with. But there are lots more. So we might think about having to adapt things like units of measure or currency even when we're working with a particular text. And this is probably going to make most of you think of the issue of localization, right? So adapting to a particular locale, environment, cultural group, and so on. And even just something like the style and the conventions of the text, even the same type of text, might be very different. So I'm sure you can't read these, but what we have basically is a year review in English and a year review in French, which appear similarly in Two Dive magazine. But if you have the chance to read them, you'll notice the style is actually quite different. So we have a very sort of fluid, casual, promotional type of tone in English, and a much more factual tone in the publication in French. So if we were taking one to the other, we'd have to do a considerable amount of adaptation. So again, that sensitivity to style is really interesting. So these are just a few of a lot of challenges. And in translation studies, very often we've had debates over the possibility of translation. And certainly looking at this range of challenges, I start to think, wow, is it really possible to do all this? Surprisingly, we manage. But it does take a lot of thinking and a lot of attention to multiple different details, but also integration, I think, of a lot of those items. And so just to give you one final example. So here, okay, sorry. Yeah, they're actually not yeah. But they're not actually equivalent, so I'll just kind of give you an example. But if we read the English, so it says when you land at your dive destination, you have a functional BC that offers a 2-position sternum strap and ditchable weight pouches. What could this possibly mean? So we've got this very compact description. How might we handle this? What kind of message are they trying to get across? Okay, so removable. Okay.
I was almost thinking an addiction, then you're going to throw them out. I mean, obviously that's not maybe not correct, but it is.
Obviously that is.
Okay.
That's exactly right. So it's interesting. I mean, we might be the idea that we could take them off. That's good. But as Isabel was saying, yeah. So if in an emergency, you essentially you would perform an emergency ascent. So nice collocation, perform an emergency ascent. And the first thing that they tell you to do, then you're usually wearing a weight belt or some kind of weighting to keep you down. So the first thing you do is take it off so that you're not struggling against it. And so, yeah, in an emergency, you would ditch them. You would ditch your weight. Exactly.
I must be wrong in assuming way of punching it and carrying it upwards.
Absolutely. And so what we kind of have to do here is take knowledge of the practices, that background knowledge, even the link that we make with ditching, right? If we understand that you ditch your weights in an emergency ascent, then ditchable immediately says, oh, that would be an emergency ascent. And then we have to figure out how to render it properly in another language and so on. And so what we're doing essentially is weaving all of these little elements together into something that hopefully works. And that's what we try and do, or at least start to prepare our translators for. Good question. So I think it comes down to adaptation and trying to deal as best you can. Now, I'm sort of spoiled because I do work from French to English, and I have all of this wonderful vocabulary that's established. In French, it's much harder, and you notice with facile à mettre et aussi, sometimes it's just not quite as nice. But then you end up trying to compensate a little bit. But yeah, exactly. And so you might potentially maybe have to say en cas d'urgence. Or look at what terminology or what collocations do we use when we're teaching emergency ascents. Maybe leave that in again, and it's all about the research at that point and seeing what the experts do. Well, that's another option. Yeah, for sure. So there's lots of different. So what we try and do basically is in our program, in our BA program, 4 years for those without a BA, only 2 for those who already have a BA. So you can imagine how intense that gets. Is cover essentially issues of general, specialized, and technical translation, as well as writing skills. A little bit of a sort of metacognitive element with comparative stylistics and translation theory. And then we also have a series of 3 courses that focus particularly on research skills, terminology, and technologies, which is really not a lot of time to integrate all of the potential tools that could be useful. But we do our best. And so that's this last category that I'm really going to focus on, and so that's those 3 courses. And it's a sequence from the second semester of second year to the end of the 3rd year. So in the first course, documentation and lexicology, we focus mainly on using resources properly. So what have other people created in terms of dictionaries, term banks, corpora, concordancers? Everyone comfortable with what those are? And so how do you use those effectively? In the second, well, the 3rd year of the program, but the second course, we work on being a good resource creator. So we do things like create our own corpora in specialized fields, or at least a mini corpus. How to spot new terms, how to research them, analyze them, to look at how they're used, and ultimately store them in a personal terminology resource that they can recycle for translation purposes. And then in the third of the courses, which focuses mainly on translation technologies, we kind of take a step back and look at how we might design a resource that's going to work effectively, how we can manage the content, so add to it, fill in blanks, eliminate what's not useful anymore, and also how to use it in the kinds of tools that are going to help us with that time factor in translation, so how to speed up, how to be more efficient, and essentially to manage the workload in as reasonable a time as possible. So we go from use to creation to management and essentially optimization. Yes, technically. So I guess we would sort of define a term as any word, series of words, symbol that has a specific meaning in a specific subject field, and it's any kind of subject field. So initially we think hard science, or we think technology, but it could be scuba diving. I've had rugby, ringette, absolutely anything anything in which there's a sort of a coherent community of users of a language. And in fact, when we get to the third stage, we talk about what else besides terms we might want to put in there. But we certainly give a start with the term. So what I wanted to focus on for this talk, and definitely I'd like to concentrate on what's more interesting for you guys, so feel free to stop me, is the kinds of resources that we encourage our students to look at, and the kinds of resources that we would love our students to look at, but they don't always, and why. And as well, I'll talk about some applications of technologies for either finding information or storing it for future use. So there's two big categories, typically, so the first course and the third course. So how many of you have already worked with Termium at any point? Okay, so Termium is the term bank of the federal government. And so it has about 4.5 million terms described, mainly in English, French, and Spanish, a little bit of Portuguese, on about 1.5 million term records. So this is a term record. This is more or less what it would look like. And it contains things like terms and their equivalents. It contains usually definitions in both languages to help you figure out what you're talking about. An example of usage very often. So you notice our famous donning scuba gear. I did notify them for right now. And sometimes some observations or explanations about usage. So they try and give you essentially a very compact synthesis of the kinds of things that you need to know, either as a subject field expert, as a translator, as a writer, and so on. So we're looking at both the linguistic level to a certain extent. What are the terms? Are they official? Where are they used? And particularly at the definitions, so the context behind them. And that gets a lot of attention, typically. And it comes from a process of analysis that's actually been quite well established in terminology. So there are certain procedures that are followed when we're creating term records. And one of them is looking at how terms are related to one another, or how the concepts they express are related to one another. So if we take a closer look at one of the definitions here, the record is going to define scuba as a type of portable diving device. So we've got a relationship with the generic, the diving device. And it also talks about what it's made up of. So it's a tank linked by a tube to a regulator, and so on. So these are two relationships that are very key in terminology research. So we're typically looking to link a term to its generic, or maybe to its parts, or see if it's a part of a whole, and so on. And what happens largely is the construction of a very complicated tree like this. So usually behind the scenes, when they are creating a term bank like we do in Termium, they're looking for those particular relationships. So typically what it's a type of, what it's a part of, and so on. Absolutely. Or traditionally, they put a lot of emphasis on the fact that these were conceptual relationships for a whole bunch of theoretical reasons. But absolutely, so there's a link. And these are among, these tend to be the fundamentals, actually. Before you create term records at all, you tend to be creating this type of a concept map or concept system. And then essentially you would create a term record for each one of these little nodes in the system. What's interesting is that this takes a huge amount of work. It takes a lot of time. And very typically, there's no trace left of this, all this work, when you get back to this. So all of that work is lost. And there's been a lot of debate over the years as to whether this is the most efficient way to handle things. So back in 1992, a research group here at combined with SITE and the School of Translation, led by Ingrid Meyer and Doug Scoos, talked about the possibility of creating what they call the terminology knowledge base. That is a description that would keep all of this information, this very rich, very detailed information, and make it available in addition to the term records that you see to not waste all that work, which I think is a very, very valid, very useful approach. It's kind of disappointing to see that 20-some years later, this idea has still kind of failed to come fully to fruition. And we may find the roots of that in a recent article that Marie-Claude Lum published, which I thought was very well done. She essentially said, you know, there's a reason that lexicosemantic or this kind of very detailed analysis or lexicosemantic analysis is necessary in creating the term bank, but it must never be shown to the user. And part of it becomes, and that's the title of the article basically, in a very poor paraphrase. But what that does draw our attention to is the fact that doing all this work and gaining all this knowledge and representing it effectively are two very, very different things. And that's one of the challenges that we have to work hard on when creating resources for students. So there have been some initiatives. This is one that I worked on a little bit, which is hideously ugly. But it is a start towards trying to express or at least make links between terms available to students, particularly student users. So if one were to look up aromatase inhibitor or AI in this resource, breast cancer resource rather than Google, we might find, for example, that it's a type of breast cancer treatment. And we might find a list of different medications that would fall under this category. So the idea being that we might be able to understand a little bit better what an AI is if we can connect it to other items and see examples. And what was also kind of interesting from a translator's perspective, and we talked about the fact that we might need to know about collocations, how to work these terms into a text. We also looked at different ways to express those relationships. So if we wanted to express something causing a phenomenon, it might give us the option to think of causer, engendrer, entraîner, and so on and so forth. So give us some suggestions for working with these items as well. The idea being to highlight relationships both at a paradigmatic level, so generic specific, and a syntagmatic level, something close to collocations. So that was one attempt. Oh, yeah.
A basic question. A term, so what's a term? What's a word, so it's a term? Because in a term bank, typically you will find nouns, complex nouns, or you find some verbs, some adjectives, perhaps predicates, but what's a term?
Yeah. So in the classical definition, a term could be any single item or complex item. Could be a symbol, could be a formula. So anything that is in a typical evaluation attached to a concept in a specialized field, that has a particular relevance for any field of human activity. And that's a very broad definition.
Because I was thinking in terms of semantic networks and of concept mapping, and I mean some terms are, you know, maybe fit well into the is a type of, is a part of, you know, like a table, for instance, something, but not all of them. So so that kind of description and structure that might not fit everything that comes with the term.
Absolutely.
And is that why we find the type of terms defined in term banks are describable in terms of type of model?
That's definitely come out quite a bit. That's one of the major criticisms of the typical approach to terminology, is that it deals very well with nouns, deals very well with objects, and other things get a little bit. Yeah, if you know, if something can be fully described by generic, specific, and part whole, great. And then we get into medicine, and cause and effect is probably far more important than part whole. And that doesn't fit in that kind of schema, and so you do definitely have to enlarge. It's a great point, and it leads me right to the next example, which I think is really interesting, which is one, this is the eco-lexicon that was done in Granada. And it's already multilingual, which complicates things, but it also includes a wide range of relationships. So the old part whole, generic specific, but also things like causes, and a huge range of other relationships. And what they've done is represent them graphically initially, which is great. So we might find a link between delta and river delta, but also things like outfall or coast or sedimentation that are associated that you might want to explore. And it's super interesting to see those connections, to see the fields start to form. And so it's a very exciting kind of approach to let's get out of this very limiting tree structure. The problem kind of comes when you try and look at it all at once. So this is delta again. You can kind of almost see it here. But there's such a huge amount of information that we might want to know. So different kinds of connections, different kinds of association. Absolutely.
Lexical networks coming
Yeah, absolutely. So it becomes very, very challenging to represent. Exactly. So they do actually use multi-word units. So for example, they still have included, they've included some specifics, for example, which are multi-word units. And then yet they do include some other things. Flood, tidal, delta, we've got here, geographic area, reduction in longshore transport. So we have these different units. And in fact, it's very hard to see, but the arrows are color-coded. They have different symbols. And I definitely encourage you to go check this out, because it's a super interesting resource that has lots of different stuff. But it is extremely challenging for them to represent things effectively. What they've done, I think, is a great solution in that you can decide to filter these links. So you can see just one type of relationship at a time, or just the ones that interest you. And they've made it dynamic, so you can actually follow. So if I start at delta and I see tide delta, I'm interested in that, I can click on tide delta and see all the relationships of tide delta. It's also a complete time suck. I mean, you could spend hours just exploring. But it's super interesting the way they've done it, the way they've tried to deal with this complexity. And that's really the big problem that we encounter, is trying to choose what to represent, what range of material, and how to represent it effectively so it's actually usable. And also just all the effort that goes into creating a resource like this. So all of these, the last one was for breast cancer. This one is just for the environment. And the next one as well is another attempt to work on the environment from a different perspective. So rather than looking at definitions and connections, they've taken a more linguistic contextual approach.
Can you talk a little bit about how technology will use how to mention that or
The sort of behind the scenes work?
Yeah. I mean, that kind of
This was done, oh my goodness, I'm going to forget the name now. This was done with actually commercial software that's designed for line mapping. And so they did adapt it for their own purposes. It's a very highly powered example of the tool I use to do this little network, which is CMAP tools. Freeware, very fun to play with. But obviously the version that was used for the eco-lexicon was significantly more developed. CMAP tools. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, exactly. So I can, I didn't do a references slide at the end because I always feel like no one has time to read it anyway, but I'm more than happy to send out the references. But they've, I'm trying to remember their.
So I'm always thinking about when you're using that kind of tool, I mean, in software, they're always kind of someone. A specific idea, they're always trying to something idea of the presentation of the software. So what are you going to do?
Oh,
The one that
yeah, I mean, I really just drew a tree. This is extreme. I mean,
Yeah.
it's all manual, so you can
the
do,
one after one.
this, yeah, I mean, this is just an access table. Again, so it's all of these different approaches. I can't, unfortunately, tell you a lot about lexicon, except for the fact that there's a lot of manual analysis of corpora. So all of these are corpus-based. And essentially, I mean, very often we'll start with the term as the starting point, and it's a huge amount of manual filtering and interpreting before we decide that it's a link to the manual. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So the term extraction alone is hours and hours of.
But that is based on corpus, right? It's the
Yeah, well, co-occurrence or potentially sort of reading and background knowledge definitions. So they've included definitions, they include context from the corpus, and of course, a strong co-occurrence obviously is usually interesting phenomenon. I can tell you a little bit more about how this one was made. So this is the DICTIONARIES from Université de Montréal. And it's, interestingly enough, it's also in the environment, which is quite fun. It's also corpus-based, so they created their own corpus and enriched their own corpus, search for occurrences. But what they've done is work using the basic fundamentals of frame semantics, primarily, which I imagine you know much better than I do, highlighting some of the different roles that we see in the expression of ideas. So if we think about what it is to sequester something, and as Marie-José pointed out, we're getting out of the classical noun model and into the verb, adjective model, and so on. So we're looking at, obviously someone needs to sequester, agent, they need to sequester something, patient, in a reservoir, which I'm always terrible with that, the destination. And they base this analysis essentially on looking at a huge number of, at least a significant number of contexts, which have been tagged manually. So this is all manual analysis, a huge amount of work, absolutely. Not only, as you say, which is a great point, not only to actually do the tagging, but come up with the procedures, come up with the thresholds, what are we going to consider, what will qualify it as fully described, when is enough, and so on. It's a huge project. But what is super interesting to me, anyway, is that there's so much attention to the usage aspect. So we really see how the terms are used in context, in authentic text. We're able to, as well, see the types of associations, which is super important. So what gets sequestered? CO2, carbon. Where does it get sequestered? In a reservoir, in an ocean. We don't see actually the agent very much here, but we know that there's an agent involved somewhere. And so that helps us to really see not only how the verb is used, but also what kinds of combinations, what kind of syntactic structures. And it's this really rich information that gets a lot of rave reviews, so I'll tell you more about it. And there's also a lot of attention to those lexical relationships that we don't typically see in those term names. So what's the antonym of to sequester? What's the opposite? Or, for example, can I use a noun to express this idea? So sequester is sequestration. And so what we're doing is kind of enlarging on that initial idea. So more about usage, more examples, more different and dynamic and visual representations of information. So something for everyone, which can be super useful, but with a very significant investment of time, and also a lot of complexity even for the user who tries to navigate these resources for the first time. And that's where we really encounter some of the big problems. resources. And that was the question that I had, and that's driving my research currently, is how we can provide this useful information, especially for students who are trying to acquire all this information quickly, take it on board, and then use it again in some way. Is it even possible to have a nice, compact, easy-to-use format that will meet those needs, regardless of what those needs are? Do I need to understand? Do I need to produce? Do I need to understand and then produce? Am I just looking for a collocation, or do I need a definition? So all that variation is hard to handle. So what I did is I took my students, my 4 intakes, and I asked them to take a survey after doing an exercise in terminology class. So I had them do some short translations, translate short excerpts, using the 2 major term banks. So I showed you Termium a little while ago. The Conditionnaire terminologique, you're probably all familiar with from the Episode de la langue française, and that the resource that I showed you, my own resource in access table format, which I called it Create Terminal. And I asked them to rate the usefulness of those items and their contents. Sorry, that should be contents, not context. For understanding what they were reading, and then for writing their translation. And at the end, which is really what it all boils down to, whether they would use those again if they had to do a similar job. And what was really interesting was that there were strong preferences for the different purposes for different tools. I guess it's really not surprising, but it was still interesting. So I asked them first if they wanted help with understanding where they would go. And this is Termium. It's high one. So it's scored out of 4, and at an average of 3.5, Termium is very highly scored. So understanding those definitions seemed to be a hugely important factor. But what was interesting is that they really didn't help very much with bilingual, with producing, with actually writing. What the students found most helpful were typically the resources that had a lot of context in them, and particularly bilingual context. And this is super interesting to us as terminologists, because we've been usually told steer away from bilingual text, that there's interference, that there are problems with the language, that it's artificial language. And yet, that's what the students were finding most valuable in their translation task. So we're definitely having to think about that and what we can do to make things work a little more, or to make these resources meet needs better if we're failing to do it so far. They did find having access to those relationships very useful for understanding those. So we need to try and preserve those and context for writing. And so again, we're struggling with that complexity. What was interesting was that all of the resources were essentially considered useful. So over 80% of them used Termium, again, working in a specialized field for that need to understand. And 2/3 of them would also use the new, ugly, horrible resource with the terminology relations, the Create Terminal. So what we've got then are students and users who are using multiple tools for multiple functions. And that's pretty heavy demand for them, and it's also time consuming, which, as we saw, is a real problem for translators in general. So there's still this ongoing issue, this ongoing problem with the resources that definitely needs to be filled, particularly from a translational perspective. So this is a direction that a lot of people are heading in, obviously. The idea of the user-friendly interface, and I think at this point we've established that it's going to need to be highly customizable, that we will be able to, we'll be needing to pick and choose what we want to see at any given time for any given purpose. But it's extremely difficult and mostly time-consuming to fill those needs. And we saw that really clearly with these multi-year projects that are still ongoing and have still only covered a fraction of the field and the cover. So I know that you've had a lot of experience.
Projects and I mean developing resources that really suit specific needs of specific clientele within such an approach, a descriptive approach, is extremely time consuming. my usability test with other disciplines and my prototype to show the same results, and students want to, learners of the language want to see examples. They want to be exposed. So I'm not surprised that in your research you see them wanting to see translated examples and parallel problems. But are we going to ever be, are they comparable are we going, they're not comparable since that's such a small prototype, you know, compared to really big functional, covering lots of terms type of tools. So this is where I'm wondering whether we are comparing things that are not comparable. Absolutely. Yeah, but if you give what I have seen in my experiments is that if you give examples and you give explanations, the students are looking for examples because they're in production context and they want to reuse. So that's, but in the comprehension context, that's different. But in a production context, they want to be able to pick it and recycle. Yeah. Oh, wait, of course. Yeah. That's, yeah. Meaning difference. What is the difference? Why am I using this in this context and not the other? Yeah, and what's the quality of what they produce? Yeah. What they want is not necessarily reflected in the quality of their output. It's interesting.
They had in that first class, so I gave this test essentially to students who are either finishing that first class 3988 or were in 3155, and so they had seen Ternium and they had seen the GDT, and then they got a demo of the new resource before they used it. Nevertheless, you're right that there's a lot of work in terms of training to be done, and a lot of the feedback that I got in terms of critiques of the Cree terminal was that they had a hard time using it, which is partly the user-friendliness of the resource, as we saw, exactly. But as well, you know, just because it's new, it's different. So they're used to Ternium, they're used to the GDT, they're not used to this layout, and so it really depends on them. Yeah, so it's a really good point, you know, what experience do they have. I didn't necessarily tell them what they should use at any given time, because I hope that by the time they've gotten that far, they've gotten a feel for what was useful when. And I think we may as well have seen that when I looked at the stats for the GDT, I was really surprised, the context center terminology, really surprised that more people hadn't found it useful. And then I realized they were mostly Anglophones, and I'd given them a mix of English and French candidates, but it seems like they mostly translated to English, so they didn't spend much time on the GDT. Yeah. So it's a good point with the context. And so that's the thing. I'm sorry, I don't want to go over time. It's about 5 after, but can I still talk tech? Okay. All right. So that's it. I mean, what comes down to then is if these existing resources aren't meeting our needs, can't meet our needs, if they can't be made to meet our needs, what are we going to do? And that's when the technology part does come in, and that's why. We put a lot of emphasis, particularly in the end of our series, on creating new resources and then managing and optimizing them. And it all comes down to our famous triple constraint, which is always very important. So we're looking for quality, obviously. That should be quality. Sorry, cost and price are the same thing. Notice how fundamental money is for terminologists and translators. So it should be cost, quality, and speed. And here we're really sort of looking at how technologies can help you obviously maintain speed while getting those quality results. All of you, I think, are familiar with the wonderful thing that is the KWIC concordancer and how useful it can be. And so we do start, as of the second course in terminology, on creating your own corpus, choosing the documents that are most appropriate for your own purposes, so straight to the topic that you want, and then looking at how the terms are used, where they're used, but also things like collocations. So we see things like rapid or sudden decrease in pressure, modifiers, so atmospheric pressure, cabin pressure, and then also we can find some of those terminological relationships that are so classic pretty quickly. And translators love the bilingual corpora as well. I imagine most of your students are also heavily interested in all of these online bilingual concordances and corpora. So this one is ReadyText, which will give you access to a wide variety of documents aligned and segmented so that you can see the occurrences in the other language. And again, of course, the translators love these for equivalents, but also things like synonyms and variants. And looking for relative frequencies, especially when we have variation, which is super important. So we see, for example, I look for decompression sickness here, and we find maladie de décompression, malvécation. Yeah, kind of an interesting flashback. Interestingly enough, a lot of this comes from civil aviation, so they have the same problems, but for a different reason. But so we can sort of see that there is some variation there. We can also kind of try and judge relative frequencies or who uses what, all of this fun and interesting stuff that can be then recycled as long as we can keep track of it. Now, these are obviously, the online versions are obviously corpora that have been created by other people, but it becomes quite fun when you can actually create your own corpus, align your own corpus, and choose what's really relevant for you to store that information for later. And that kind of work, obviously, it takes time, but it pays off for students and translators for sort of two different reasons. The first one being that you can manually consult it as you would another tool, but you can also use it as part of a translation environment tool. It's probably new for most of you, certainly not Marie-Josée, certainly not Marianne. So basically, just to give you an overview, the translation environment tool is a package of applications that interact with one another that essentially allow you to store information, so previous text and terms, so similar to what you find in the term bank. And then it allows you to recycle them as needed using automatic detection, automatic searching. So the idea is to accelerate consultation and make it essentially effortless. So you can create those by text, your bilingual corpora. You can create, you can extract terms, so spot terms automatically. So we see here I've submitted a text about decompression sickness to a term extractor, and it's managed to find some interesting terms like nitrogen bubble, decompression sickness, presence of nitrogen bubbles. And we can even try and match up terms in the two languages. So see what we found in an extraction in French. So, mal de décompression, plongeur sous-marin, décompression, and so on. So this is typically a starting point when you're working with a new text with a translation environment tool. So you store your by text, and then one of the first things you would probably do is look for new terms, and then store them in what's essentially your own customized term bank. Yeah, so rather than trying to find a resource that's going to work perfectly for you, choose or look at the information that someone else has chosen for you, you're essentially building your own custom model. So you choose what languages, you choose what you want to know about them, and you can even choose the layout yourself, how to organize. And then you store this in what ideally turns out to be a fairly attractive presentation. So it's all up to you what you put in. Terms, synonyms, variants, equivalents are pretty much a no-brainer. But you can add lots, so you can add definitions, you can add context, usage labels, sources, notes, explanations, links, pictures, anything that's useful for you for your own purposes. And the idea here is that you can adapt to put as much or as little information as possible. So this is a model that looks at the different software, considerably less attractive. But it's interesting to kind of see that you can stick very close to the term record model. So the definition, context, term model that I showed you earlier. Or you could do something that's considerably different. So strip it down, keep it very simple, but maybe add things like the complex items you're interested in, so the multi-word items, or related terms. So if we talk about decompression thickness, the informal term would be the bends. So I might want to record the fact that in English we might talk about getting bent. Not something you typically find on a standard term record. So you can choose what you want to add basically and store it the way you want, which can be an advantage. It does. Absolutely. For students to create their own fiche, and it at least calls your attention to things, which I think is nice. So this is, as I mentioned, you kind of define your structure going in, and then in a way it sort of reminds you, like, oh, think about this. If you find something, yeah, exactly. So very often what will happen is we'll start with a pretty stripped down model that has, very little, add to it as needed. So what typically we do is maybe a little bit backwards. In the terminology class, we have them fill out this actually more detailed than this. So they have to look for everything. And then in the technologies class, we have them strip it down to just what's essential, just what they feel is necessary for their particular project at that particular time. And then that forces them to kind of evaluate how is this useful and what do I need it for and what do I want out of this tool. So it's a fun judgment call. Absolutely. Yeah, so in fact, these translation environment tools more and more intended to be networked, so that everyone is contributing to the bytext corpora, everyone is contributing to the term bases. So this is SDL Trados, which I forgot to cite. I'm really sorry. SDL Trados. So multi-term is their tool, and they're a really highly developed framework. So it's very technical, easily networked. This is the kind of system that's run in companies with dozens, if not hundreds, of users. This one, on the other hand, is a Canadian product from Analytics called Legitel. And in this case, you're actually working in a Word document. So as long as everyone has access to that Word document, everyone can potentially contribute to it. Or you can copy and paste everybody's records and access them all together. Exactly. You can each have your own Word document and then pool them and search them all at once. Or potentially you can copy and paste in one big document. And does anybody At this point in our teaching, typically what happens is that students will do a terminology project where they have to produce 2 or 3 records like this, and then we evaluate them for quality. In the translation technologies class, the assignment based on this essentially it's a homework assignment to spend 45 minutes doing whatever you can for term records. So that could be multiple really basic term records. It could be half of one really detailed record, whatever you can do. And so the reflection is, where were your priorities? How did you manage your time? Where did you put your effort? And then they do, after their assignment, they do a commentary and explain their choices and evaluate them. So it's kind of fun to see where they put their emphasis. And I haven't quite gotten there yet, but what I have been doing is working in small groups in different subfields. So somebody's doing training, and someone's doing equipment, and someone's doing health and safety. And so they have to kind of agree on what their form should be, how to store it. And that gives them a lot of debate as well, because nobody comes in with the same model. Yeah, so it's fun. It's fun to play with, and I think that really becomes important, because out in the marketplace, if they're freelancers, it's entirely up to them how they construct a term base. Or very often our students get asked to design somebody's term base if they haven't implemented these tools yet. Big job. So it's important to kind of know how to do it. Particularly because the efficacy of your tools really depends on how you structure it and what you do. So the next step, sort of the next level of technology, is to automate searches and reuse automatically. So translation memory helps you to recycle sentences, terms, and equivalents, and so on. Okay, perfect. Yes. Right there, exactly. So yeah, so there's a lot of potential in the technologies. There's a huge amount of potential, but it also means mastering a lot of different tools and knowing them really well. And that's where the collection of electronic resources and translation technologies, or CERT, comes in, trying to provide students with information that they can easily access and apply. So I was going to tell you all about what people think about CERT, but basically it's wonderful, is what they think. It is, yeah, it's the collection of electronic resources and translation technologies, and it's available on LinguistTech. So linguisttech.ca.
There's a nice video of you there
Okay.
explaining your work.
Yeah. So yep, linguisttech.ca. And when you go on the site, if you go under Get Informed, you'll see CERT, so collection of electronic resources and translation. And basically, it will introduce you to all of these different, or students, to all of these different tools. So from monolingual concordancers, bilingual concordancers, term extractors, text aligners, translation memories, term bases. So all of these different tools. It takes our students 3 courses in a year and a half to get through them. And even then, that's a bit packed. But the nice thing is that with this kind of a tutorial, you can take a look and maybe pick and choose. I don't think outside of the translation menu you want to do everything, but 1 or 2 little things would be really helpful. So it's designed to help you pick a tool, or pick a type of tool, and then pick a specific example. Definitely appreciate the interest. I really thank you for letting me come and lather on forever about these.
Well, thank you very much.